All right. It looks like we got a few in the chat waiting for us. We've got
Great.
a few channel regulars. Jay, in September, give me a holler if everything's sounding good on your end. It probably is, but it is that everlasting paranoia that I have. All right, everybody. Welcome to the January 2024 Industry Pro interview. And today we're going to be talking to Mitch Steele of New Realm. Adam Makes Beer is now a podcast. Check out Spotify and Apple Podcasts and see all the long form brewer interviews we've done. After you subscribe, please leave a review and comment as well, because it really helps support the work I am doing. Also, if you are new to the channel or podcast, go to Adam Makes Beer on YouTube, click the playlist tab, and see tons of info, brew days, techniques, tutorials, now over 563 videos. As always, if you're getting value out of this content, please follow, rate, like, comment, and share with your brewing friends and craft beer enthusiast buddies. And if you have the means and feel as if my content has benefited you, consider a channel membership for $2.99 a month. It gives you priority for Q&A live streams and quarterly merch drawings, or drop a super chat tip in the comments or chat. Fridays, February's live stream Q&A will be on Tuesday the 6th at 7 p.m. So drop your questions to me on YouTube or in any of the comment sections below any of the content I have posted. February's Industry Pro interview live stream will be the 13th at 7 p.m. with guest Julian Trego of Beechwood Brewing. So stay tuned for details on that. And if any of you are going to the Ohio Craft Brewers Conference this week, I'm leaving tomorrow. Me and a couple of the folks from Sonder are going to be heading over there. I'm going to be giving a talk on Thursday. Please make sure to say hi, shake hands. We can cheers our pint glass or what have you. Please stop by and say hi. I'm always looking forward to seeing folks and everything like that. And right now we should thank our fantastic sponsor, Blickman Engineering. Blickman Engineering has been the pioneer of nano brewing, and they have helped hundreds of successful breweries achieve their dreams since they started with one barrel systems in 2006. Now offering a full suite of brew houses up to 15 barrels skidded and insulated, matching cellaring equipment, keg washers, grain mills, and more, sized specifically for the craft brewer. Blickman Pro brewing systems are competitively priced without sacrificing quality, and the simple design and factory direct support from our brewing experts get you up and running faster than anything else on the market. When you're ready to go pro or just kicking the tires, be sure to reach out to them for expert advice and a partner to help you through it all. Turn your dreams into a reality by reaching out to Phil, Tom, or Josh at ProSeries@BlickmanEngineering.com. Again, that's ProSeries@BlickmanEngineering.com. Blickman Engineering Pro Brewing is proud to be the equipment sponsor for this channel and is committed to helping every brewer, no matter where they are in their journey. As I mentioned before, today's guest is Mitch Steele, brewmaster of New Realm Brewing Company. Mitch has at least 36 years in the brewing industry. Notable companies include Stone Brewing and Anheuser-Busch, multiple GABF awards and World Beer Cup awards over the years, the 2014 Brew Association Russell Sharer Award for Innovation in Craft. We're going to be talking about innovation a little bit later. You sat on multiple committees. You've really done it all in the industry. Mitch, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Adam. It's great to be here.
Definitely. So we were chatting before we went online, and I had some time to dig into some of the different podcasts that you've been doing. It's one of those things like when you get somebody on the show, you don't want to just basically have a complete replay of what somebody else has done. And man, you have some killer interviews out there. In particular, I really loved I think it was the brewer to brewer interview that you did with Sean O'Sullivan from 21st Amendment.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. Yeah, a couple of, and we chatted about it before. A couple of guys smooth on the microphone, good conversationalists, and that was a really fun one. If those of you out there have not checked that out, you should, because it's a lot of fun. You dug into some of your brewing background. You didn't go straight into beer originally. Where was kind of that passion for fermentation? Where did that start?
Yeah, that started at University of California, Davis. I was a student there in the early 1980s and kind of wondering where my path would lead. And I was a freshman in the dorms, and I got dropped out of a couple of classes I was trying to take because freshmen get last choice, and if there's no room, there's no room. And the RA in the building said, "Well, you're at UC Davis. If you don't take the intro to winemaking class, you're an idiot, and everybody should take that class. It's a wonderful class." And so I took it, and about 2 classes in, I realized that was it. I was a science guy. I was coming to the realization that veterinary science, which is what Davis was known for, was a very stringent curriculum and probably more than I wanted to try and tackle. And this was more my speed. It was science, which I was really into, life sciences, that kind of thing. But it was also art, and there was a bit of art involved. And I've always been somewhat artistically inclined. Whether I had talent or not, it's a different story, but I always really enjoyed art. And I remember sitting in that class, and they were talking about the different grapes that come from France and the different wines and how they were different than American wines and things like that. And I'm like, man, this is amazing. This is perfect. Yeah. I love this. And so I was gravitating towards a major that was, at the time, they don't offer it anymore, but at the time it was called fermentation science. And essentially what it is an applied biochemistry major where you learn about fermentations, wine, industrial fermentations like wastewater fermentations and things like that. And then there was beer as well. And I didn't know about the beer right away. And I was taking a microbiology class, and Michael Lewis, who was the professor of brewing science at UC Davis at the time, came in and gave a guest lecture. And I'm like, beer? You got to be kidding me. I loved beer since I was a teenager. And
well, but he's also one of those guys that you can just listen to. You just want to hear him talk. You know what I mean? I think some guys with certain accents are just blessed in a way, but between him and Dr. Bamforth, I swear those two could read anything and you could just listen to it. It sounds so good.
Yeah, to sit over a beer with either one of those folks is just amazing. And Michael Lewis was a pretty intimidating man. And he could be pretty blunt and hard to take his feedback sometimes. And a lot of people refuse to take any of the brewing science classes. A lot of the winemaking folks say, "Oh, I'm not going to take a class from that man," but I always appreciate brutal honesty as long as it's legit. Sure. If it's based on something that's not right, then that's a different story. But he was pretty more often, I think he was right, mm-hmm. And I just loved it. I love studying brewing science. And it just really was something that I gravitated towards. And and I just loved learning about how brewers in England, and it was mostly England and American lager focus, just because of the circumstances at UC Davis. And, it was interesting and fascinating to me to hear how brewers in the United States were making their beer and how brewers in England were making their ales and how it was different. And I just soaked it all up. It was wonderful.
Yeah, that's interesting. Something that struck me as we were talking about that. Is there ever one of those things? Because as I mentioned, what I didn't mention in your bio, you wrote the book on IPA. Mm-hmm. You have a very, very well documented, illustrious career in this industry. When you were talking about, like Dr. Lewis, and sometimes there is that like I don't know, that reputation or that aura to them, right?
Mhm.
A little bit, right? As as you've climbed in the industry, is that ever something that you have been aware of when you're working with new people coming in? Like working with younger people in the industry saying, "Oh, hey, I'm going to be going in and sitting down and talking with Mitch Steele," or anything like that. Is there anything that you ever tried to like change about your approach with people, having like, known, Dr. Lewis or anything like that?
I'm going to say no. It's always kind of weird for me. I guess, when people come in and they talk like that, like I'm, you know, eh, to me, I'm happy to share what I've learned. I've
Hmm.
always been that way. I'm happy to help people become better brewers just based on what I've learned. And I've always looked at it from the standpoint that I had so much help and so many people teaching me things that are really valuable for me, that I
Hmm.
want to share those with people that, people that work for me or whatever. And, over time, I guess I've realized that I've gotten to that point where people want to hear what I have to say sometimes, not always though,
Depending on the audience.
yeah, yeah. But it's and that's really flattering. Honestly, it's not something uh, I tried to do. It's just circumstances have worked in my favor where I can do that. And not to say that I haven't worked hard to learn in this business, because I have,
Certainly.
but to me, this business is all about relationships, and sharing the science and sharing the art and sharing. I love telling stories, and if there's a lesson to be learned from a story, great. But if there's not, it's just a fun story, that's fine too.
Sure. And I think that's one of the things. I think sometimes when I remember when I first got, and my first professional job was teaching. I taught for 10 years, and I felt as if I had to know everything going in. You know what I mean? And sometimes I think like it makes people approachable and likable if you don't always have to, you don't have to have all the answers. You can be approachable, and you can
Yeah.
just be grateful for the experience, right? Because the reality is when I have these conversations with different people or whatnot, like, and we're going to talk about innovation a little bit later, but
Mhm.
what we do as brewers, so little of it is like revolutionary. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants here, right? We're building off of information that's been passed down to us. Functionally, what's going on with beers? We're converting starch to sugar. We're utilizing water. We're utilizing heat in some form, pressure, pumps, and that's the super majority of what we're doing. You know
Right.
what I mean? And so, yeah, I think there's good to have a little bit of humility with that whole process.
It's funny. I do a lot of collaboration beers, and I still do. Not as many as I did with when I was with Stone, but I still do several a year. And I get the question sometimes, what are you doing here? Why do you want to do this? And I said, look, it doesn't matter who the brewer is. If I'm spending a day with a brewer, I'm always
Hmm.
going to pick up something new, something
Hmm.
that I hadn't thought of, something, whether it's a new hop or whether it's a technique. I may not always take it and use it or
Sure.
anything, but I'm always, I always look at it as I'm gonna see something I haven't seen before in
Hmm.
this, and then I'm gonna also get to know somebody who's likely a pretty cool person. Otherwise,
Yep.
we wouldn't be doing the collaboration together. So, I just look at everything I experience as an opportunity to learn and just add perspective to what I've already learned, and I think that's important. And not to go on and on about this, but I remember talking to brewers who had been in the business for 5 years, and they were telling me, "Yeah, I've learned everything I need to know," and I'm like, "No, what? What?"
Yeah. Yeah. And my career for a while, so this is year 13 or so for me. Early on, it was all about proving myself to me, right? Like I wanted to
Mhm.
win awards because this is going to validate me. That
Yeah.
validation is going to make me happy, right? which is, as foolish as it comes. But it's one of those things where it's actually become the pursuit of getting better. That's actually what I've kind of reframed to over the last several years, and consequently I'm considerably happier. But it's reframing on, like we say, like, what we're doing is aiming for the bullseye, knowing we'll never hit it, right? And and sometimes you get close, right? But it's about the pursuit, right? It's about always getting better, always learning, always staying hungry, because it's exactly that. I've had brewers tell me before, well, I didn't expect this beer to be perfect, and then they go on to explain to me how the beer is perfect. And sometimes sometimes those comments that the folks sitting at your bar give you feel really good. And that's nice. And I think we should be allowed to enjoy those for what they are, but we can't, that can't actually be what drives us and what feeds us with this whole pursuit.
Right. Yeah. It's, I enjoy getting positive feedback as much as anybody, but I always know in the back of my mind the things I still think I could have done better with whatever it is we're talking about. Right. So it's, it's nice, but it's not the end all. But certainly it's nice to be recognized and, just to see people enjoying what you've made, that's the best thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So you had mentioned the wine side of things with your start at UC Davis, and this is one of the things. So for me, when I got into fermentation, it was home. It was brewing beer at home. It was all beer focused. I've listened to a couple talks here and there. It kind of some areas where there's maybe some overlap between beer and wine as far as some yeast experimentations, things like that, but. I know wine played a big role for you early on. Are there any key takeaways from your time on the wine side that's benefited you as a brewer?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I spent 8 years in the wine business, and for 4 of those years, I was moonlighting as a brewer. So I was doing both. I think I worked for a winery in Central California, not in the Central Valley, Central Coast of California. Called Almaden. And Almaden at the time was probably the number 2 or number 3 largest winery in the country behind Gallo and Paul Masson or somebody. But the winery I started at had a 4-acre barrel cellar, and the barrels were stacked 5 high. Every single drop of Almaden wine went through wood in that winery. And so I learned a lot about barrel handling and oak and toast levels and all that kind of stuff. That was really cool. And that was those first few years I was in that business were really fun and just eye-opening. But a couple of takeaways from that experience, just from the technical side, learning about wood and barrel aging and the importance of that subtle oxidation and that you get through barrel aging, running a centrifuge, those kind of things, filtration, all the stuff you don't get hands-on experience at college, I got in the wine business before I went into brewing. So that was very helpful. A couple other things that are kind of, I learned the importance of having a good team. And when I say that, the first winery I worked at, we had a team, and it was a union winery. It was AFL-CIO union. And these guys, these folks that worked in this winery were family. They had worked together for years. I was a newcomer. They gave me a lot of ribbing, but they also welcomed me. And I look back at the 4 years I spent with that group of people going, my gosh, that was probably one of the best work crews I've ever worked with. And then I got transferred to another winery in their system, and it was a little bit more, rambunctious and contentious. And then over the years, I've had different work crews at every place I've worked, obviously. And I think I look back to that first role I had as an assistant winemaker, and just how important it was that people realized that they were all trying to do the same thing. We were all, shooting for the same successes, and we all worked together to get there. And then I also learned, when you have people that are kind of negative or don't like to follow the program, how challenging that can be, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that was my first work experience, and I've always tried to capture that first place, that vibe, that sense of belonging and that sense of togetherness that group had, in every place that I've worked since. And I've had, some success with that, and some not, but
Yeah.
it's just, it's interesting that, I look back at my time at the winery and I remember the people more than I remember the work.
Yeah,
And
man.
and that's kind of cool. It was a neat experience. But I still love wine. I love barrel aging beer. I love playing around with wood. I don't get to do much of it anymore. That the whole wood aged beer thing has kind of gone down the tubes.
Hmm.
Um, but certainly, and I certainly learned how to taste Brettanomyces in the wine business. Um,
Sure.
that's a major flaw in an American red wine is Brettanomyces, and so I had to learn how to pick that out when we were doing barrel tastings. So, yeah, there's a
Certainly.
lot of crossover, but yeah, I picked up a lot from those 8 years.
Sure. Something I thought that was interesting you talked about, and sometimes, it's one of those things that sometimes teased a little bit, this idea of, oh, well, it's a family here. But I think if you've been fortunate enough to have that experience, I think it's like when I was at the last brewery I was at, and I had it was a small operation. There was three of us that worked full time in the brewery, but there were two younger folks in their 20s that were training into the industry, hard workers, wanted to grow, wanted to study. But then on top of it, like, we just clicked personally. And when
Yeah,
you're in a small space, I mean, you're always scooting past each other. There's no elbow room in a brewery, so you're always right there working together. And it was just magic. And I remember telling my wife and some friends at the time that I'm like, I don't know if this might, like, when I'm wrapping up the career, 20, 30 years from now, whatever, and I'm looking back, this might be like the most magic thing that I was a part of from a staffing thing, right? And
yeah,
that's not to say anything about, different people aren't hardworking or different things like that, but sometimes you just catch that thing. What do you think? What do you think was a key component to creating that atmosphere?
Oh, I think it was the leadership at that winery, that really did that. Both the winemaker, I got hired on as a lab tech there, and then there were some promotions in the company, and people moved up, and so I ended up getting promoted after being there for 4 months, and then being moved into my first supervisory job. But I think the leadership, it was a corporate company, right? It was
Mhm.
national distillers that owned Almaden, and you could get caught up in all that corporate stuff that really, kind of devalues the human side of things sometimes. But these folks in this winery, the people that were leading this winery, wouldn't let that happen. And so, there were a lot of extracurricular events that we did. Everybody was treated with respect. There was a lot of, I just remember the managers there, the winemaker and the assistant winemaker, when I was in the lab, I remember how many times they asked the people doing the work questions about how things were going and what was going on and what were they seeing and things like that.
Yeah.
And they took that input and they did something with it, and they valued it.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of helped foster this: we're all in this together. We're all going to work hard during harvest season. We're going to kick butt. And then when it's over, we are going to throw a party and we are going to have fun. And it was just, I don't know. It was, to me, it was leadership, and it was, and having the right people in the right place,
Mhm.
because it's not as simple as leadership. You also have to have the right people there, and
Yeah,
they had a good team that had worked together for years, and knew how to poke fun at each other, but also knew not to take people seriously. Whereas other places you'd see serious confrontations,
yeah,
when people would get on other people's nerves. And in this place, it was kind of like water off a duck for everybody, which,
sure.
so, I walked out of there going, wow, is this what working's like? I can do this, and then I go to the other place and it's like, oh, wait a minute. But yeah, I think, it's really important. I think authenticity with the leadership is like really, that's really what does it. You knew that they weren't asking just to put something out there to make them look interested. They were asking because they genuinely wanted to know the answer. Yeah. And yeah. I saw that with those folks. And I thought about this question a lot when I saw it on your list of questions, and I was like, yeah, looking back on that and I'm reminiscing, I haven't thought about that job in a long time very seriously. And it's like, wow, that's really what it was.
That's awesome. Maddie Mack in the chat. First time I'm seeing that name, so welcome, Maddie. Any advice for a craft brewer looking to switch over into the wine industry?
Wow, that's a great question. I don't know if I have a good answer for that because the wine industry's changed tremendously. I would say, it's been, when did I leave the wine industry? It's been over 30 years. I would say be ready for long hours and 24/7 operations during harvest. You don't get days off during harvest. That's actually one of the reasons why I left. I didn't enjoy harvest as much as a lot of winemakers do. I kind of dreaded it because it was from the early to mid-August all the way through October. I work every single day. And
what necessitates that? Is it just having to process the raw material within the appropriate window? Is that?
Yeah, it's all nature. It's all grapes, being coming in ready to harvest. And you just, and as a business, they loaded up and they wanted to keep that going every day if possible, so that, they can maximize the use of that equipment that's only used 3 months a year. And there's those kind of things. But I think for me, that was the hardest part about winemaking was the harvest season. And I worked for a big winery, so it was a long harvest season. We got grapes from all over California. If you work for a smaller, more boutique winery, your harvest season is going to be compacted a little bit, and it may not be as hard. If you work in a winery in Virginia or Northern Georgia or something like that, you're probably harvesting grapes for about 30 days. But, in California, where there are grapes grown all over the state, you're getting grapes that ripen in August and grapes that ripen in November. And it was just, that's the nicest time of year in California. And I couldn't go out and do anything. And I just got tired, and after 8 years, I was like, I think I'd rather make something where I can,
mulch here all the time.
Right? But what else? Know your lab work. The lab analysis in wine's a little bit different than what's in beer. It's not hard, but it's different. I think it's good to know how to do sulfur analysis, and all of this analysis may have changed in the 30 years I've been gone. But I did a lot of lab work in the wineries, a lot more than I ever did in the breweries. And not to say that the brewing lab work's not important, because it really is. But the winery lab work was it was something that was a really big part of the operation. I'm not sure what else I could say to that right now.
Sure,
I have to think about it.
No, that's great. I mentioned earlier you had a conversation with Sean O'Sullivan of 21st Amendment, and we had a common thing happen, bit of a shared experience. You mentioned, so after the wine side, you get into the brewing side, and you end up having kind of your introductory experience at AB. And you ran into a bit of a language barrier with the word FOSS.
Yeah, that was just one of many.
Well, I've had a similar thing. So I've the scale isn't that much different, but a super majority of my brewing career has been in 1,500 barrel pubs, 7 to 15 barrel brew houses. And just now, I just recently it was like August of 2023, I started at Sonder Brewing, which was started by a guy, Chase, from originally from New Glarus. And so he came in with a larger production experience and also the verbiage that they used at New Glarus, right? And so when I'm coming in, and so first of all, they're metric, and I've never used metric. There's language that they're using that I've never used before. So things like that are a bit of a big shift. What was some of that shift like for you transitioning to AB?
Yeah, it was very real. I was coming from a 14 barrel brew pub, and I, even though I had the degree at UC Davis, uh, Michael Lewis was from Wales, right? And so most of what we learned from was British brewing techniques and British verbiage, which is very different than German verbiage, which is very different than American verbiage. And so I walked into Anheuser-Busch, and I got hired in Fort Collins, and they had this whole training program set up for me, but not the first day. The first day, they just wanted me to follow somebody around. And so I'm following around a supervisor there. And he said, okay, now we got to figure out a fossing schedule. And I'm like, wait, what's a foss? And he's like, it's a transfer from primary fermentation to lager cellar. And I'm like, okay. I said, is that a German word? And he goes, yeah. And then there was words like Shana, which is the chill proofing, process there. And oh my gosh, there were so many, but eventually I learned. But I was coming from essentially a home brewer and English brewing background, so and so everything was different. Anheuser-Busch did work in barrels. They didn't work in hectoliters or anything metric. Everything, for the most part, everything was standard American units, degrees Fahrenheit, barrels, flow rate and feet per second, those kind of things. I remember going to the Merrimack, New Hampshire brewery when I was in corporate brewing, and they were using an old German brewing temperature scale, degrees Reamer. And and I was like, I don't know what this means. And and they had this chart, that said, they kind of kept it hidden, but it was this chart that had degrees Reamer to degrees Fahrenheit. And I'm like, I don't know. And while I was there, we switched over to Fahrenheit to run the brewery, and that was a huge adjustment for the brewers that had been there since the 1960s. But for me, it was like, oh, thank goodness,
Well, it is, and it was funny because I took this new job, and it's like, you want to hit the ground running, and you want to make a good impression and everything like that. And also, this is the first time that I've worked on an automated system. So I've not worked on an automated system before. So there's that. There's some language barrier, and then there's the metric thing, and it really had me feeling like a fish out of water. But just recently, listening to some podcasts, it was the first time where I actually caught myself having to think about what they were talking about, because they were talking Fahrenheit. They were talking about a mass schedule. It was like some craft beer and brewing talking about cold IPA, and they were talking about fermentation temps, and I had to feel my mind shift thinking about that, right? Because I've been thinking Celsius for so long. So now
you're ingrained. Yeah, that means it worked.
Well, now I'm actually just, now what it is I'm still waiting for like the actual understanding. Like, right, I'm working on like rote memorization right now. Like it's not integrated between the two, so I'm hoping at some point that will happen. But yeah,
that's awesome. It's hard though, and we talked about going metric at New Realm when we started, and we decided against it because we're a bunch of old folks, and we didn't want to shift gears like that. And And the business is built on American barrels,
Sure.
right? And case equivalents and all that kind of stuff. And,
Yep.
if you go metric, that messes all that up. And
It does.
I.
Well, and for some of this stuff, I mean, I have no problem at all using metric. I mean, grams are so much easier to be precise with and things like that, and especially like on a pub scale, there's a lot of room for that, whether it's brewing salts, acid, different things like that. But yeah, the whole thing is a bit of a switch. So we talked just to kind of just referenced a hair of your time at AB. If you want more information on Mitch's time at AB, do go ahead and check out that podcast. I believe on Brewer to Brewer. But I did have a question that came in from Dow Scoggins, who I'm probably going to be talking to Dow a little later this year. Dow runs the US Open Beer Championship competition. And he had this question that he sent in to me. He said, in reference to Mitch making the transition to Stone, he said, what questions now, and I believe it's Greg Cook, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. What questions did Greg Cook ask him when he went to work for Stone? Now, I don't know anything. I don't know. He said this is a good story, and maybe I should have. Now I'm realizing. Hopefully, you don't feel like I'm springing this one on you. Hopefully, it's something you feel comfortable sharing.
Oh, yeah, I'm fine.
Okay, cool.
Was so. Just to give you a little background here, so. I was 14 years at Anheuser-Busch when I got hired at Stone, and Steve Wagner, who was Greg's partner at Stone, and Steve ran the brewing operation, wanted to hire me. And Greg was, and I found out later, he was very nervous about the whole idea of bringing somebody in from Anheuser-Busch.
The AB guy, yeah.
Yeah, he just was not comfortable with it at all. And I went through 2 solid days of interviews at Stone. And Greg was in several of them, and he tried to trip me up. And there were a couple things that I'll share. I remember my first night, I hadn't talked to Greg yet, and Greg joined Steve and I at dinner at a little restaurant in Escondido. And and Greg's a tough person. He's really hard to read. He's very focused on his personal values and what he thinks is right and wrong personally, and he really tried to convey that to the team at Stone. For better or worse. I mean, there were times when that was really a valuable kind of component to his leadership, and then times when it kind of rubbed people the wrong way. But regardless, Greg was committed to his personal values, and I always really respected that about him. But he came in and he asked me, what kind of coffee I drank. And I said, well, I live in New England. I live in the land of Dunkin' Donuts. And he looked at me and I said, I hate Dunkin' Donuts coffee. And then he said, oh, tell me more. And I said, well, I play music with a guy who has a farm stand in New Hampshire, and a petting zoo of all things. And this guy was the bass player in this little band we were in, and he roasted his own coffee and sold it in his store. So I was buying coffee from him. So I told him that story. I said, yeah, I buy Bob's coffee, and it's really great coffee, and I love it. And that's all I drink. And that was not the answer he expected or wanted. And I think he was impressed by the answer, but he was hoping to have more of a different conversation with me, I think. And so finally, after I told him that, he kind of sat there for a second. Then he looked at me. He goes, "What do you think of Starbucks?" And I said, well, we don't have Starbucks in New England. And this was before Starbucks was everywhere.
Yeah.
And I said, we don't have Starbucks in New England. The only time I've had Starbucks was in Seattle, and I enjoyed their coffee quite a bit. And he goes, well, I'll never buy Starbucks coffee. And I'm like, okay, here it is. And so then I said, well, that's interesting. Why wouldn't you do it? And then he went on to tell me, that he thought of Starbucks as a very predatory company that would put all their stores in places where there were other coffee shops and drive them out of business. And that was something that he really hated about that company. And I'm like, okay, all right, now I know a little bit more about you and what's important to you. And and that story resonated with me a little bit because my father-in-law went through a similar situation with another big company coming in as killing the businesses he was in. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. I remember another time, Greg was friendly with Dan Carey at New Glarus, and I worked with Dan in my first job at Anheuser-Busch. He was a supervisor in Fort Collins, and I remember walking in the door and seeing Dan and going, "Oh my God, Dan Carey, what are you doing here?" Because he's the one who installed our first brew house at the first brewery I worked at. So I'd known him off and on for a few years. Sure. But anyway, Greg was friendly with him, and so he sits me down in his office for like a more formal one-on-one interview. And he said, we had Dan Carey out here last week, and he was, walking through the brewery, and I knew you were coming in for an interview, and I knew you guys both worked at Anheuser-Busch. So I asked him about you. And he said, Dan told me one thing that you needed to do to improve as a brewer. And I'm like, really? And Greg said, I want you to guess what it was. And I said, I was kind of like, I have no idea where this is going. I don't know. And finally I said, okay, I'm too corporate.
Yeah.
And Greg said, no, that wasn't it. He actually didn't tell me anything. I didn't ask him the question.
So something that I love about this is the way you described Greg. You said that his core values are it was a very polished, and I'm not, and that's not an insult at all, but I absolutely love the way you described him. That he how did you describe him again?
Well, I said he was very committed to his personal core values and wanted to share that with everyone. And that's absolutely true. I think that's one of the things that made him so successful was that, obviously he didn't care if he rubbed people the wrong way, but he also was very genuine in his core values and what he thought about things. And he lived what he said, and that's, something to be respected.
How much of it, because that can be a double-edged sword, but on the positive side, on the positive side, how much of that was contributing to kind of Stone's rise back then? Because I remember even out by me, I mean, I was Midwest. I was Michigan, Grand Rapids, Michigan, and we had Stone out there. Those were the days of the bombers. You know what I mean? Yeah. The big painted bombers. Yeah. So Stone was everywhere. How did that big personality help to drive that?
Oh, I thought it was crucial. I think that was the main driver. Stone had good beers. They had great beers before I got there, and they had great beers after I left. But I think that ethos and that personality of Greg's and that whole "it's us against them" mentality that he had, I think that's what created that business for them. And they milked that for a long time. And it worked until it didn't work anymore. And, and things change and people change and, values change in the beer industry. And as the beer industry grew, that kind of, it's us against the big guys and you're not worthy stuff, started to not ring as unique and noble as it was in the beginning. And that's just I think that's just a natural progression of the business. But I think that had everything to do with Stone's success. And I thought Greg, a lot of people have mixed feelings about Greg, but I thought he was a genius. I thought he was visionary, and I didn't always agree with everything he asked me to do or wanted to do with a company. But I thought his ability to relay his vision and why he wanted to do what he wanted to do was something I had never seen before or since. I thought he was a master at really getting people to understand why he wanted to do what he wanted to do and how he wanted to do it. And, it was a really neat place to work for 10 years. And it was something that, I thoroughly enjoyed the experience, and we had some fun with it, like, I remember being in meetings and somebody say, well, there's only one person in this company that thought this was a good idea, when something failed. And, but that's the thing, you got to take risks, right?
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
this business, you have to take risks, and you have to be willing to be the first one out there with something, and it may work and it may not. I mean, think if Enjoy by IPA had completely backfired. Would that
Uh-huh.
have slowed Greg down? I don't think so.
Uh-huh.
It turned into one of the biggest successes we
I
had when
forgot
I was
about that
there.
beer. You're right. You're
Yeah,
right. You're
but
right. Yeah.
and there were people in the company that thought he was crazy for trying to do it, but we all pulled together and got it done, and it was one of the best things we ever did when I was there.
Dude, that was wild. I
Yeah.
forgot about that, and that really was, and that was part of that. There were certain breweries that had certain messages back then, and a lot of it was it was that anti-establishment beer thing, right?
Yep.
It's the we do what we want to do thing. I mean,
Yep.
that's what I mean. Founders, they drink the beer they want to make.
Yep.
They make the beer they want to drink, right?
Yep.
And they're selling Dirty Bastard and this,
Yeah.
that, and the other thing. You know what I mean? And yeah, so it's that's a kind of an interesting trend. When did you see that? What because I think we're pretty clearly in a different space.
Yes,
That
we are.
whole we're big, we're bad, we're aggressive, we do what we want, that independent streak thing. When did that start losing efficacy on the market? When did that start falling away? Am I making sense?
Yes. I would say for us at Stone, probably around 2013, 2014, we started realizing that the arrogant persona maybe wasn't the best thing for us anymore. And we weren't an arrogant bunch of people. I mean,
Yeah.
everybody that worked at Stone was very passionate about the beer and the industry and well liked in the industry. Um, and we started doing some things to try and soften that arrogance persona a bit. And I saw that happening my last few years there. And I think, it's Stone. Arrogant Bastard Ale was never, there's no mention of Stone on the label,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's always Arrogant Bastard Brewing Company. Well, they made more effort to separate that from Stone,
Mm-hmm.
create different, not quite a different company, but just a different, concept for Arrogant Bastard than for Stone, and really enhance the separation of those two brands a bit. And that was all in an effort, I believe, not being behind the closed doors of the decisions like that. But my understanding was that was an effort to try and soften the perception that we were a bunch of arrogant bastards at Stone. It was fun for a while, and
Yeah.
people dug it, and being rebellious is fun.
Yeah.
And then when you start getting big and you start dealing with a lot of big companies, then it starts to wear a little thin, I guess. And I think to your point, the industry is in a different place than it was back then,
Yeah.
so yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the things I do like, as we have conversations like this, I always like to talk to people about, I was actually talking about to a local brewer who I want to have him on later in the year, and he's been giving me the cold shoulder because he doesn't feel as if, there's nothing about me as a brewer about why we should be having an interview, right?
Okay.
And my thought to him was, I'm like, listen, first of all, we're friends. You love beer. I love your approach to making beer because you respect the process. You're chasing it. That's what we're going to talk about. Let's do that. But I think sometimes people overlook the fact that they have specific skills that make them successful in their field.
Mm-hmm.
And so for you, what do you think is a specific skill set or talent that you have that served you well in the brewing industry?
Oh my gosh. I think,
and don't worry about like a humble brag. This isn't like one of those situations where I'm trying to get you to self praise, but it's one of those things because everybody has something, right? Everybody is bringing
yeah,
something to the table.
honestly, I think the thing that has driven me the most um, is just an innate curiosity.
Mm,
I want to know what happens if. And and a lot of times I have these what if scenarios going through my head. What if we were to make this beer but use this hop instead of this hop?
mhm,
What if we were to do this in the brewing process? What if we were to do what that brewery over in Europe has been doing for decades and tried it with one of our beers? Those kind of things. So I was just soaking things up and ruminating over all sorts of different and I think that got me a long way in the business. It really helped with my creativity, which I think has driven a lot of my success in the business. I
okay.
don't think that's the whole thing, though. I think you also have to know how to run a brewery and know how to monitor the processes. And I remember taking classes at Anheuser-Busch, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm in a brewing school that's being taught by some of the best brewmasters in the world. I need to really work my ass off to make sure I learn here. And I studied my ass off, and I did very well in the class, and that got me the promotion at AB to
Yeah.
new products. But when somebody's teaching me something, I want to learn. And if it's something I see a lot of value in, I'm going to take the extra step and learn it. So I think that, combined with curiosity and just wanting to understand, what happens if you try something that's a little bit off the wall, um, and just be willing to fail at it, I think it works. I mean, I've had my share of beer failures and beers that didn't come out the way I had hoped or envisioned they came out. But on the other hand, you have those rare home runs where you try something, you're not sure it's going to work, but you have this vision for it, and when you nail it, it's the best feeling in the world, right?
Mhm.
And so I think I think that has been a major part of my success, is just not doing things the same old way that
Mhm.
everybody's done them, and trying new things and new ideas. I also think, one of the things, and I don't know if the people that have worked for me would tell you different, but I, I really appreciate the ideas that the people who have worked for me over the years have come to me with.
Mm,
And again, we run three small breweries at New Realm, three 5-7 barrel brew houses, for innovation and things like that. And if they come to me with an idea, I might pick their brain on it a little
mhm.
bit, and try to. I had a conversation with Drew, our head brewer down in Auburn, about a malt he wanted to use in a Kolsch. And I said, look, I'm totally okay with you trying this. I'm curious to see what it does, but I want to understand your thought process as to why you
Yeah.
want to use this malt, so that it
Mhm.
makes us both better brewers, and
Mhm.
and hopefully the people that have worked for me know that I like to pick their brains as much as they like to pick mine. And I think
Yeah.
that's helped.
Sure, sure, and it is a process too because I'm going through that right now with a little bit with Chase. Like I'm used to, I've not most of my career I've not worked for another brewer.
Hmm.
So I've had creative control most of my time in the industry, and so this situation going into Sonder, they're in year 6.
Hmm.
They have their calendar, they're packaging beers. You know what I mean? Like they're an established brewery with their brands, right?
Yep.
And so it's not like I'm going to come in and start, just making my own beers. Now, thankfully, we do have, like a 15 barrel side that we can run, one offs through and things like that.
Yeah.
And I'm starting to do that with him, but there's getting on the same page. And so that's interesting to me because you have multiple brewers at multiple locations. Just this past week, Chase and I were able to sit down and start talking through it was mostly to get used to uh, his recipe writing calculator, but I was
Hmm.
explaining to him how I like to brew Munich Dunkel. And so we're walking through everything from the grist to the water profile, the mash, the hopping approach,
Mm-hmm.
why I like to use certain malts, you know, and different. And that's such an instructive time to be able to spend with another brewer, right?
Yeah.
Because like I think at the end of the day, if we talk about enough different styles enough times, you can understand where I'm going with the beer, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
and it's like this with music or with cooking, but there's in some ways there's a through line. Not that every beer is the same, and I'm not talking house flavor or anything like that, but I think that a brewer should in some ways have a voice, right?
Yeah.
And in some ways there should be a connection with those beers, whether it be fermentation profile, this, that, or the other thing. For me, what I like to try to do, like what my pursuit is I always want to have beers that are incredibly approachable. I like to
Mm-hmm.
have bold flavor. I like to have bold aromas, but rather than having this many people be able to drink my IPA, I would rather have this many people be able to drink it, right? And
Yeah.
so for me, pardon me, striking a very approachable balance with the beer, right? That's the beautiful thing for me, being able to say the only thing that's going to stop you from drinking this beer is temperance, right? At a certain point, right? Like the beer
Yeah.
is not going to stop you from drinking it. That's kind of my goal. Like that's what I'm aiming at. And so, but it was just so good to talk through like the way I see something in accomplishing that beer
Yeah.
with another brewer. What does that process look like for you and the brewers you work with? It seems like you have a pretty like they have a lot of options, a fair amount of free reign to do on the experimental side to be able to do things.
Yeah, and that's how I was working it at Stone as well. I remember and with regards to what you were talking to, I had a lot of conversations like that with Steve Wagner, who I think is completely underrated as a brewer. You know, Greg Cook was always kind of the face of Stone, but Steve's the one that came up with all those early Stone beers that really set them apart from everybody else. And I remember. And he came in and my gosh, I still don't believe this. Within a month of me being there, he said, "Look, I'm going to ask you to change some beers, and I want you to put your own ideas and your own spin on them." And I'm like, "Well, wait a minute. I don't know if I want to do that yet, And, but he'd say like, "Old Guardian barley wine. This is the way we brewed it for the first few years. Change it if you want." And and rather than just changing it and doing it like I would have done a barley wine back in 2007 or whatever it was, I sat down and talked to him about it. And I said, "What was important to you about this recipe and how you put it together?" And and from there it's like, okay, we can, I'm still not going to change it, but I might tweak it a little bit just to see, like, so with a barley wine, a good example, Old Guardian barley wine, I started using English malts in it because it had all been American malts throughout its whole life. And I started bringing in some English influence into it, but still keeping the character of the beer because I thought that was important.
Yeah.
So with our people, all I ask them to do is if they're going to brew something, is share the recipe with me. And then if I see something unusual or something that intrigues me, I'll call them.
Yep.
I don't really veto anything. I like to say the only two recipes I've ever vetoed, one had coins in it and one had meat in it. And the other one was a beer with beets in it. I didn't want to do that. And of course that was Chris Ketchum at Stone, and as soon as I left Stone, he brewed the beer with beets in it.
Bro, I'm pretty sure that if you're brewing with meat, you're just making stock, right? Isn't that like what's happening there? Okay,
right, yeah, no bacon in the beer, please. But in general, and I mentioned this earlier, I'm very curious. So if they come up with an idea that I wouldn't have come up with, I want to see what's going to happen and how it works. And and to me, that's the beautiful part about craft brewing is being able to do those kind of things on a small scale, either get an excellent beer that could drive future innovation for the company, or you come up with something that you're always going to learn, right? So it's like yeah, let's try this. Let's try this unusual Australian malt in this German beer and see what happens, or whatever.
Yeah.
And I, to their credit, are the people that run our breweries are very talented brewers in their own right, and I know how important creativity is to them and our team, and so I want to give them the opportunities to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. So, and there was that word you had mentioned, innovation. Um, I mean, I guess to me, it's an interesting idea. I know you have access to multiple tap rooms, so you're not just having to rip new beers on the big system the first time and everything like that. When we talk about innovation, what does that mean to you? Is it a process thing? Is it an ingredient thing? Yeah, what's your thoughts on that?
It's everything.
Mm.
It's rethinking everything. I think, if it's a recipe thing, brewing as a new style of beer, that's one thing. That's one component of innovation. The other component is, finding a lower cost way, process wise, to make the beer and make it taste the same, and maybe do some things in the process that people haven't done before. Um, I get fascinated when I hear people talking about fermenting with lager yeast at high temperatures. And it's like, well, wait a minute, you're not supposed to do that, right? Lager's got to ferment at, 45 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit or whatever the number is. And you have people making great lagers that are fermenting them at warmer temperatures and getting them through their cellars faster. And, I think anything innovation is thinking out of the box and with established brewing styles and brewing procedures. And I do think an important part of that is having a good base. So you got to understand, how classic beer styles have been brewed over the years, what process wise, what's been done, what's been important, points in the processes of those beers. But then if you have that knowledge and you're armed with that knowledge, then you can start making educated innovation trials as opposed to just random, reckless innovation trials, right?
Yeah.
I had
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go. Oh, I was just going to say, and now innovation for us also includes non-beer products. I've had to learn how to make seltzers. I've had to learn how to make cider. I've had to learn how to make ready-to-drink cocktails, dealing with spirits. All that stuff is part of our business right now, and it's not stuff that was easy for me. I had to step back, and even Hazy IPA. Hazy IPAs became a thing when I was not brewing. I spent 2 years essentially not brewing as we were starting New Realm. And, we opened up and one of the big critiques we got is we didn't have a Hazy IPA.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, there's a reason for that. I don't know how to brew one.
Yeah.
And so I had to learn, right?
What was your gut on that style when it first came out? Because I know that there was some, I would say that my industry friends had some hesitancy when it came to those beers. So in Michigan, the hot one was from Old Nation was M43, I think. That was the hot hazy in our neck of the woods, and it was beers like that were met with some hesitancy by some folks on the pro side. How did that style strike you when it kind of first hit the scene?
Well, initially I was a little confused by it, I'll be honest. And then I was a bit skeptical. And the only reason I was skeptical was not because I didn't think the beers were tasty. And I want to make that clear. I was skeptical because I had lived through black IPA, white IPA, all these other IPA offshoots that came and went in a flash, right? And I just figured this was another one. When I actually started to learn how to make them, and I remember very early, right when I was leaving Stone, I met up with some folks at their, they approached me and they wanted me to taste some of their beers, some folks from Treehouse. And I tasted their beers at the Craft Brewers Conference in Philadelphia. And I thought, wow, they're really good. And I had gotten a taste of how excited people were about these beers. And I'm like, this is really interesting. but in the back of my mind, I was like, well, in 2 years, when we start getting New Realm up and running, these are going to be passe, right?
Yeah, right.
And I was completely wrong, of course, and I had to learn how to make them. But when I got into that learning process and started picking people's brains and reading all the articles about it and all the podcasts that there were about it, and I'm like, wow, there's some real science here. And I don't know
Mhm.
if the people that originated these styles realized how different they are from
Mhm.
what was being done before. But to me, that is innovation.
Mhm.
The idea of brewing an IPA with really high chloride water. Well, nobody was doing that. Nobody would have thought of doing that.
Right.
Brewing an IPA with a mid fermentation dry hop. That was
Mhm.
like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And but as I started to brew ours, I realized how different they were and what an innovation they really were, and also how hard they were to brew. Because one of the criticisms I kept hearing from a lot of brewers, that were poo-pooing the style was,
Yeah.
oh, it's just lazy brewing. You're just not
Yes.
not clarifying your beer.
Yeah.
And I'm like, after I brewed them for a while, I'm like, that's absolutely incorrect.
Yeah.
That is not it at all. It's really hard to get a beer hazy that's got that kind of hop
Mhm.
character in it, and
And that
hop
stable
profile, and
haze and
yeah, and stable haze, and
yeah.
and I said these are really hard to do well. And
Mhm.
it's easy to do them if they taste like you're burping up hops or whatever. But to get a balanced beer that's hazy and has all
Mhm.
that juiciness and everything that's going on in those beers, it's hard.
Yeah.
And I'm the first to admit that I was wrong about being skeptical about them, and I was surprised about learning about all the science that was applied uh, to the brewing of these beers to get that end result. I think it's a fascinating facet of IPA brewing. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, but I was skeptical at first, and there was a reason for that, and it wasn't because I didn't like the beers. It had nothing to do with that.
Well, and I'll say too, though, because when people started chasing it, so I had M43, which was dependably good. Every time
Yeah,
I had that beer, it was good. It was tasty, pretty well balanced, nice aromatically. But then, we would get other beers because at the time this stuff started popping off around us in Michigan. I was at this little beer bar and it had like a nano system in the back that I was brewing on, and so we would get different hazies in, right? And sometimes, I mean, they were just, it looks like somebody was, half your pint would be the bottom of the fermenter,
yeah,
and things like that
yeah,
too. So I think sometimes there was some stuff that was driving that, because
yes,
we were all guessing. You know what I mean? Because there was times where, I mean, early on, people were like, "Well, you need to throw flour in there.
yeah.
You gotta get flour in the kettle. You got to be doing this, that, and the other thing." Did you ever read the Scott Janish book, the new IPA?
I have, yeah.
Yeah. That's been, I just brought that one into work, to pass around for some of the folks in the brewery, because it's I don't know, it's an eye opener for me. Yeah, there you go. And for somebody with no formal education, right? Like
Yeah,
that's stuff that I really need to dive into. And yeah, man, it's fascinating stuff. And I mean, to me, it seems like what Hazy IPA is, it's the demand, or it's answering the consumer call for approachable beer. And I think we're looking at approachable beer coming more into demand, whether it be lagers, which I don't know if it's the rocket ship that maybe some of us want it to be, but at least lagers are trending up. You know what I mean? It's trending in that direction. But and these fruited beers, that sometimes taste more like squeeze box juice than anything else. There's a lot of approachability being demanded from the public, and I think Hazy IPA is a big, is the result of that in some ways, right? um
yeah.
so I mean, as far as I can see, I don't know what's going to I don't know what's gonna take that beer down for the foreseeable future. It looks like one that's here to stay for right now. It has some challenges on the production side too, especially because,
Yeah.
of course, you're putting that beer onto store shelves in cans, correct?
Yep.
Yeah. What do you feel are some of the number one challenges of putting that beer onto store shelves? Because first of all, going into a can, I mean, that's that's tough on a beer. You have to have your tight
Yeah.
specs there. And then,
Yep.
it's going out into the marketplace. You would love it to be in somebody's cooler, but you know that it is on warm store shelves as well. What are some of the most demanding things about producing hazy for large scale distribution in cans?
Well, I think this, you nailed it when you mentioned stable haze. I think
Mhm,
that is the key. Um, I think making sure your haze is not comprised of particulates coming from the fermenter
mhm,
is really important, because if you're bringing over hop pellet material and yeast and all that kind of stuff, that's the stuff that settles out.
mhm.
You need a good protein haze in a hazy IPA to make it somewhat stable. um, I think really that for us, that's been the biggest thing. And then the other thing is just flavor balance. With adding that many hops in a dry hop, not getting, I don't want hop burn.
Mhm.
I don't want those hops to taste harsh. I want them to taste fruity and smooth and be a signature part of the flavor profile. And getting that consistent has been difficult at times,
Mhm.
just depending on production demands and whether you're dry hopping at the same time or the same gravity, at the same stage in the fermentation. Those kind of things can really change the outcome of the beer. And learning that took us a while.
Yeah,
It's like, when to optimally do that and get the flavor development we want.
sure. Do you find do you centrifuge beers at New Realm?
Yeah, we do.
Okay. Is there, and this might be a bit of a, an uninformed question. I've not worked with a centrifuge before. Is there an expected, is there a level of turbidity that you can spin a beer to where you reliably get rid of hop burn? Hopefully that doesn't sound like too silly of a question.
Yeah, I don't know, because we're not hopping at a rate where we really get hop burn to start
Sure.
with.
Sure.
So I don't have a good answer for that.
Sure.
We had to work a lot on our centrifuge protocol to get the beer to be what we wanted it to be, and it involved, running the bowl faster, running the beer through slower, or slowing down the bowl, whatever. We did all sorts of trials with that and came up with a set of parameters for our hazy beers that has worked well for us. But as far as getting rid of hop burn, I'm not sure. I just know that I don't want hop particles in the finished beer.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
and to your point, in the early days of hazy IPA brewing, you go into a little brew pub and you'd get a glass full of type 90 hop pellets,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and that's not, the real good brewers of hazy IPAs weren't doing that, right?
Yeah.
That's just, somebody doing something and trying to make these beers without really, um, having that good science background behind it, and or experience, and which is what it takes. But
Yeah.
it's interesting as and having all the contacts I do in this business and talking about hazy IPAs with people that are making them. What I learned is everybody's doing them differently.
Hmm.
There aren't very many common. I mean, there are some common techniques, but I mean, even timing of that dry hop, that mid-firm dry hop. Some people aren't doing it at all. They're getting all
Yeah.
their biotransformation from their whirlpool hops. Some people
Uh-huh.
are just waiting till the end of fermentation so they can collect the yeast.
Yeah.
Some people are doing 3 dry hops during the time in the fermenter. It was all over the place, and you just had to kind of find something that worked for you and stick with it.
And even in some cases, that's the exciting thing. And it's one of the things that keeps me like humble and hungry, right? It's like, I think Hazy has brought out the fact of how little we understand about sometimes the raw material,
Yep.
sometimes the role of the process, how the process and the raw material play together. I think it's been a big eye opener. And I mean, obviously, you come from a more technical background, but I think I think we hear, I think you've heard things before where sometimes I feel like there's still an awful lot of wives' tales that are thrown around surrounding beer and processes, right? Which
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
kind of wild to me. You know what I mean? And yeah, so anyhow.
A little knowledge is dangerous
Sure.
sometimes, and certainly, you see that with a lot of conversations related to beer. People just get it wrong, and it's
Yeah.
like, wow, where'd you hear that? That's not the way it works. But it's always kind of been like that. I think um, Hazy's been one of those ones where a lot of the really good hazy brewers weren't quite as open with what they
Uh-huh.
were doing and how they were
Yeah.
getting what they were getting as brewers had been in the past.
Uh-huh.
Craft brewers anyway.
Yes.
I think we're seeing the same thing with non-alcoholic beers, and
Uh-huh.
the people that are making them really well and doing them really well aren't very open about how they're doing it. This industry, I've been in this industry almost since it started. I came in the late 1980s and was following it for 4 years before then.
Mhm.
And one thing that I always loved about it was the brewers talk to each other about this kind of stuff.
Mhm.
And with those two styles in particular, I see less talk and less openness about it. And the business has changed. Like we've talked
Yeah.
about, it's so much more competitive now than it was
Mhm.
30 years ago, 20 years ago, when there was room for so many breweries and you just wanted people to make good beer if they were going to get into the business. And now it's like you got to take a little bit of a competitive business stance with some of this stuff, and I get
Well,
it.
and the stakes are different for a 7 barrel neighborhood pub than they are for somebody who's distributing regionally.
Yeah,
Those are two different, they're two different businesses.
they sure are.
They're two
Yeah.
different businesses. So a next little dive. I've been I'm a bit of an NFL nerd, and in particular a fantasy football nerd. And so all of my fantasy football analytics podcasts are essentially over now. So I have more time to be diving back into podcasts. So I just started listening to there's a roundtable that they did on craft beer and brewing on cold IPA. So a little question for you. Have you played much with cold IPA? And then kind of spinning off something you mentioned earlier, is cold IPA essentially going to be black IPA, white IPA, and things like that? Or do you feel as if there might be some legs to the style?
So to answer the first part of your question, yes, we brewed a cold IPA. And the first one that we brewed at New Realm was with Sean O'Sullivan. It was a
Oh,
collaboration
nice.
beer.
Yeah.
So Sean's a big fan of the style. And when we started talking about doing a collaboration together, he said, "Would you be interested in doing a cold IPA?" And I just learned about them.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, sure, yeah, let's do one. And we've done a few since. Our 5th anniversary beer that we did last spring was also a collaboration with it was with several brewers, but that was a cold IPA as well. I like the style. I think anything that combines crispness with hop flavor is something that
Mm-hmm.
works for me personally,
Mm-hmm.
and I like that about cold IPAs. I don't know whether they're going to stick around. I'm not sure they're distinctly different enough from
Mm-hmm.
other things that are out there to make them stand out. But one thing I will say is that in the years following the COVID shutdown, I did start seeing a lot of them being brewed, a lot more
Mm-hmm.
of them. So I thought they had come and gone. By the time we hit COVID, I thought they were done.
Yep.
And the fact that brewers are still brewing them gives me a little bit of hope that they might be around for a little bit. But
Sure.
in the world of what's becoming a world of hoppy lagers,
Yeah.
there's West Coast Pilsner, there's India
Uh,
Pale Lager, there's all these things that are really not markedly different than cold IPA. So I
uh-huh.
don't know if they're going to get lost in the shuffle or not. But I like the style.
Sure.
I do enjoy drinking them. I really do, because as I've gotten older, fuller bodied beers just don't agree with me as much
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah, I believe that. Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
I feel that. I've got another question from this is from September and June, and he asks, kind of spinning off of this topic, has the hop taken over craft beer, and if so, which it has, is that good, bad, or otherwise?
Well, I mean, I'm a huge fan of hops, so I'm going to say it's good. I think, if you're brewing something that only has four ingredients in it, being able to discern those four ingredients in the beer you're drinking, I think is always going to be a good thing. Whether, granted, water is not something that people think about when they drink beer, but certainly in the past, 20 years, hops have become very primary. Um, Malt has always kind of been there as a significant flavor contributor. I think people are starting to understand the importance of the flavors that yeast contribute to beer flavor at this point, especially with the hazy IPAs and the yeast that
Mm-hmm.
biotransform and the thiolizing yeast and all that stuff that's going on. Um, I think it's great, and honestly, this is not with a perspective of the beer business as a whole. It's just with the perspective of the importance of agriculture and hop farmers' relationships with brewers that I've seen go leaps and bounds further than I ever thought it was going to go in the past 15, 20 years. The fact that there are, I mean, hop selection right now in Yakima, Washington is probably second only to the Craft Brewers Conference as far as the total population of brewers in the area when that's going
Mm-hmm.
on. Um, I think that's a wonderful thing because beer, hops are such an important part of beer. Even if the beer is a low hop style, the hop is important. And the relationships with the hop growers has shown that there's a tremendous value to that in how that has evolved over the last few years with hop farmers now understanding what brewers are looking for in hops.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think everything about hops just fascinates me as a brewer. And I love the fact that hops are now being talked about it to the extent that they are, and people can pick out certain varieties in beer. It's almost like wine, like a wine grape. It's, people like Chardonnay or they like Cabernet or they like, some other, more obscure grape variety. The varietal is important to the glass of wine, and I think the hop is too.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly that's style dependent and such, but it's if you brew a beer with a really obscure New Zealand hop that gives you a flavor profile you've never had in a beer before, and it makes your jaw drop and immediately start looking for that hop again in another beer, then the hop's done what it's supposed to do, and
Mm-hmm.
I like that about beer because it just makes it more interesting.
Now you talked about hop selection, and so I'm gonna ask you a hypothetical here. You have
Okay.
brewer A and brewer B. They have the same equipment, uh, same access, or same raw materials, same ingredients, same processes, good quality measures. One brewer A is able to select his hops, and brewer B buys his hops on the spot market.
Mm-hmm.
How big of a difference? How big of an advantage is that for brewer A?
Um, in my mind, it's really important. It's especially once you have a few years of hop selection under your belt, you know what you're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're buying on the spot market, you don't know what you're getting. It's you can you might be able to have some clues, but you're not going to be able to go and rub the hops and see if they have those flavor components that you think makes your beer your beer.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important. I think it's one of the best things that's happened to the business is that people do this. And we don't do it for every hop we use, but we certainly do selection for the what I call the big three
Mm-hmm.
hops that we use in our beers. And it's a consistency play, right? Because all you have to do is go to one hop selection and go through 10 lots of a certain variety and see how different they are to realize how important it is.
Mm-hmm.
And you might get really overdosed on piney on one lot, and you might get citrusy on another. You might get herbal or grassy, and over time, over the years, as you do this and you select hops, and if you keep good records, which I highly recommend,
Mm-hmm.
you can go back and say, okay, last year I selected this El Dorado that was very lemony. that's what I want. And that makes our beer taste better, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you go into the room and you're presented with 10 or 12 lots of El Dorado to sift through, you can pick the ones that are lemony and maybe have a little bit less of that herbal
Mm-hmm.
licorice character that El Dorado has,
Mm-hmm.
and it's gosh, it's such a great tool.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's expensive to go out there. It's expensive to do it. There, you have to buy a certain amount of hops to even qualify for most suppliers to even be able to be invited to the table. But I do really think it's critical, and
Mm-hmm.
and it's not to say you can't make good beer buying your hops on the spot market, because of course you can, but you may not get the consistency year to year to year that you might want.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really, I think, where hop selection is most important.
So that's very interesting. Do you, in the situation you're in, do you find that you need to kind of layer in and blend in those crop years from year to year, or is your selection tight enough that you can roll directly from your 2022 Citra into your 2023 Citra, or do you try to layer those through and kind of blend those years and then rotate it fully into the next crop year?
That's a great question, because that's a really good technique, and certainly that's what we did at Anheuser-Busch, and we were doing that at Stone. I don't do that at New Realm,
Mm-hmm.
probably because I just haven't had the bandwidth to make it happen.
Sure.
But I think it's something that I think is a good way to do it, because a gradual transition to the new crop year, phasing it in, going 25%, then 50, then 75% until you're out of
Yeah.
the old crop
Yeah.
year
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you go 100%. That's the way to do it. That's the
Yeah.
way a great brewer does it. And I think New Realm, we just haven't really had the bandwidth to manage to that level.
Mm-hmm.
We're still a really small company, but I do think that's something that's a great technique and something that people should consider doing.
Well, first, so this kind of begs the next question. Edgar on LinkedIn asked, he said, ask him which operations has been harder and why between ABI, Stone, and New Realm. Which one has posed the most challenges?
Um, yeah, and that's a really great question, because I think the challenges were all different in every one of them. I think Anheuser-Busch learning how to navigate the culture of the company and the people was probably
Mm.
the hardest thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's the brewing the beer. They knew how to brew good beer. You didn't have to worry about that. You just had to learn, and you had
Mm-hmm.
to do it in a way that was, politically savvy in a corporate environment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, um, the one thing that people at Anheuser-Busch valued more than anything was new people coming in, just asking a lot of questions.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you do it this way? And not to say, I think you should do it this way. Why do you
Yeah.
do it that way?
Yeah.
It's more, what went into the process of deciding to go down this method of doing things. When you had people that were young at Anheuser-Busch and asked probing questions like that, they were the ones that did very well in the company.
Mm-hmm.
I think Anheuser-Busch had a ton of resources, and just navigating that was a challenge. So going to Stone, they already had great beer, right? And one of the things that Greg always tried to trip me up on was asking me how the beer tasted and whether I'd make any changes, right? And I'm like, no, that's not what I'm here for. I'm not going to change the beer. The beer's great,
Yeah. Yeah.
But he tried to get me on that one several times. But
How is that for you? How is that for you with somebody taking that approach? Is that difficult to handle, or does that just roll off the back, or is that a challenge? I could see that for me being a little bit of a challenge.
It was a challenge.
Sure.
I think I came in, and 6 months after I'd been there, he's still doing that to me. I thought that was a bit much.
Yeah.
I think he didn't trust me being kind of craft centric, and
Uh-huh.
And I think pretty early on, I proved that I was, and I had that mindset. But, I think that was tough for me at Stone. I think the other thing at Stone, what I did is I went out there and I learned how to run their brew house, and they had an automated system it was a Rolec brew house, and it had an automated system, and the people that were brewing there were brewing when they were on their old equipment while they were commissioning this new brew house. So there was a huge gap in knowledge about how the automation worked. So I just said, okay, I don't need to be brewing beer here. That's not what they need me to do right now. What they need me to do is dive into the automation, understand the automation, what drives the changes from step to step to step, and then train the brewers on how that works. So you can't mash off unless you've met these conditions, those kind of things. Get that documented, get the training out there. And then just work to make the processes that they had in place better, and work to make the beer more consistent, because it was already great beer. And, so getting people to buy into that really was not that hard. I think people saw what I was trying to do, and I went into Stone. And the big thing for me is I didn't want to come into Stone and act like I knew how to do everything, because I knew that wouldn't go over well, and I also knew it wasn't true, right? And so I went in, and again, learning my lessons from Anheuser-Busch, I asked a lot of questions, tried to understand the thought processes that went into why they did things in the cellar the way they did, and then we'd talk about it and see if there was maybe a way we could make it easier for them to do, and make it more consistent. With Stone, one of the challenges was we didn't have the resources we had at Anheuser-Busch, right? So I had to figure that out. We built the lab when I was there. We had a microscope when I got to Stone, and a pH meter, and we built the lab from there. And by the time I left 10 years later, we had a world-class lab with GCs, and we had a Century program that was right up there with the best craft brewers in the country. And but we had to build that, and so I think the big challenge at Stone was the constant expansion mode, and expanding our brewing capabilities and knowledge as we grew the business as well. And that was a lot of work. It was a tremendous amount of work to try and keep pace with the expansion of the brewing production, to keep pace with the technology that we needed to manage that process. We added centrifuges when I was at Stone. When I left, we were looking at hot side wort centrifugation. So there was all this. We just never stopped at Stone. We never did not have a capital plan at Stone, and process improvements and process expansions was what we did. So New Realm. The challenge at New Realm is not having anything, not having money for capital projects, not having a big staff, not having. We did get a good lab in both of our locations, a lab that is a bit higher than a brewery our size would normally have, at my insistence. But we've been short staffed the whole time I've been at New Realm. At Stone, one of the things that Greg preached was have 15% more fermentation capacity than we say we need, always, and have 15% more staffing than we say we need, always. It's completely the opposite at New Realm. We just don't have the finances to weather that, right? So we're running short staff. By the time we finally get the decision approved to hire somebody, we're behind, and people are working 60, 70 hours a week just to try and keep up with the production. And then you've got the learning curve to get somebody trained up. So that challenge is completely different than anything I've had to deal with before. But on the other hand, it gives you the opportunity to build the team you want, bring on good people, and you go through some pain doing so. But, it's in the end, it makes it worth it, when you have a great team. But New Realm's tough, and the other contributing factor to New Realm is just the brewing business in general, the inflation that everybody's dealing with raw materials and shipping and transportation, and the wages all going up across the board, and you're trying to run a business and make money, and you've got to make sacrifices, and trying to decide where those sacrifices come is really, really hard. It is is something that just eats at you night and day,
Mhm.
you know. So, it's a different it's a different ball game at New Realm, and a lot of it is because the brewery business is a completely different ball game.
Mhm. Yeah, it seemed to kind of turn, and maybe I'm newer in the industry, but it did seem to I mean, Bart Watson from Brewers Association has been talking about it for a little while. You know what I mean? At
Yeah,
least kind of saying, like, hey, listen, it's not just to the moon anymore. You know
yeah,
what I mean? So yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
It's challenging, and obviously there's so many breweries that are closing right now because they can't afford to keep operating. It's a tremendous amount of pressure that everybody is facing, and you got to be smart. This is where innovation shifts gears and turns into making your processes more efficient. How do you do it?
Mm,
How do you conserve on CO2 when there's CO2 shortages going on everywhere?
mhm,
How do you reduce your water usage when water rates are doubling in a year?
mhm,
Those are the
mhm.
challenges we all face, right? And
Definitely.
so it's 10, 15 years ago, you didn't have to worry about that kind of stuff, and
Mhm,
and now you do.
mhm. Well, Mitch, I think we're gonna kind of wrap around
Okay.
this last question here. And so I do like to kind of have those big picture, a little bit more career type or big picture type conversations when I get a chance to chat with people. So if you're gonna go back in time and have a beer with young Mitch in his mid later 20s, what would be your advice to him, either as a brewer, as a professional, as a man? What would be your advice to that spry young fella?
Um, Trust your gut. Trust your gut. When the situation's not right, you'll know it.
Mhm,
Don't try to overthink things that are not clicking with you. I think that's one thing that's important. I've hung on to some jobs in my career that I probably should have vacated a little bit earlier and saved myself
mm,
some heartache. Um, I think one of the other things, and this is kind of hard for me to say, but fear of failure. Talking about that for a minute, fear of failure can be a powerful motivator, right?
mhm,
It prevents you, it motivates you to not fail, right? But at some point, that fear of failure, you have to be careful that it doesn't become debilitating or a
mm,
problem for you. When you get to the point where every decision you're making is stressing you out, and you're wondering whether you're doing the right thing, and it's dominating your decision making process, eh, that's not good for the beer,
mhm,
and that's not good for the company. And I think one of the things that you need to be willing to take risks, and when we're in a climate like we are right now, um, the idea of failing is dominating the mindset of so many people right now. And I think, um, yeah, it's dire for a lot of people, but it's not the end of the world, And I believe in beer, and I believe that beer is going to be a beverage for people forever. There's a reason it's been around for so many thousands of years. It's not going anywhere. It's just changing a little bit, and
mhm,
um, and I think a lot of people are making decisions right now that may not be the best long-term decisions for them because they're afraid of what might happen if they don't make the decision. And I'm not saying, I'm not second guessing anything. It's really hard right now, but I just, the more I think about the decisions I've had to make and things that we've had to do, I start wondering if we're taking ourselves and the prospect of failing at something to a level that's harming us as a company.
mm,
Um, or as a brewer, it's a really crazy time. And that's not everything, in the company. It's more along the lines of, personally with decisions about the beer and staffing and things like that. I think we're you know, it everything is so overthought that sometimes we just don't go with our gut. And that's, that kind of leads back to trusting your gut, and just, doing the right thing. And
Mm-hmm.
we have a guy that works for our company who I love working with. And he says, look, it's the right thing to do. We're going to do it. We're going to figure out how to do it. I love that. I love that attitude, because if it's the right thing to do, it's the right thing to do. And it's not to quote Ted Lasso, but it's like, you know, um, you know, now I forget the quote, but it was something along those lines. We're
Yeah.
doing the right thing is never wrong,
Yeah.
kind of quote.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I believe that, and I've
Mm-hmm.
lived long enough to know that that's usually true. And and I don't know. I think right now everybody's in the business is kind of in a world of hurt. But for me, looking at myself at 21, I was pretty idealistic. I'm still pretty idealistic.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's valuable. I think keeping that
Mm-hmm.
idealism is
Mm-hmm.
important. Believing in the business, believing in your skill set, believing that you can contribute, believing in the way you think the industry should be.
Mm-hmm.
It may not be there, but it certainly isn't going to get there if you don't believe it anymore.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
that's kind of where I sit on that
Definitely.
question. I've,
Definitely.
I've, I've done some things I wish I had done different, but I don't have any regrets with my career and the way it's played out. Honestly, I've gotten some amazing opportunities. And I did it because sometimes I took a chance,
Mm-hmm.
leaving AB to go to Stone. That was agonizing for me.
I
But in
bet.
my heart, I knew I wanted to be at a brewery like Stone. I wanted to
Yeah.
make beers like they were making at Stone. I wanted to have that kind of creative mindset that they had at
Mm-hmm.
Stone, that they were brewing these beers because they liked them, and they wanted to tell people why they were good beers,
Mm-hmm.
and shout it from the rooftops that this is a great beer and you've never tasted anything like this before and you're going to love it once you try it. Um, but AB did not operate that way.
Mm-hmm.
AB was never wanted to be the first in category in anything, and Stone did, and I
Yeah.
love that about Stone, and that's what led me to take the job.
Mm-hmm.
Was just the chance to work in that kind of environment, and that worked out so well for me. But I was scared to death. I was
Mm-hmm.
scared to death. I was going to move my family across the country. I
Oh
was
yeah,
going to
dude.
take a job at a company that I didn't know that much about, except just what I'd seen them say in public. And,
Yeah.
and I was leaving a company that was going to be around forever. So I thought, and, and it was a huge risk. And, the other thing I'll say, to my 21-year-old self, family matters.
Yeah.
Family is critical. Involve your family in your career to the point that they can weigh in and help you with your career, and don't neglect them.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, no, and a lot of that stuff hits home, man. A lot of that stuff hits home for me. I'm very I'm very grateful that you took time to chat with us today, take the questions from the chat and other listeners like that. Mitch, I know we didn't jump a ton into this side of things, so if you can just tell us where we can find New Realm and anything that you have coming up for 2024 that you want us to know about.
yeah, cool. Thank you. So New Realm, we have two production breweries. One's in Atlanta. That's where we started. That's where I live, because we also do most of our innovation work in Atlanta. We have a bigger brewery in Virginia Beach. That was the old Green Flash brewery that we took over when
Mm,
they shut it down. Um, all of our breweries have restaurants. We have a small brew pub in Daniel Island, just north of Charleston. And then we have just opened up a small tap room, a 7-barrel brew house on the campus of Auburn University, which has been great fun, because one of the things that brings me great joy is being able to teach people about beer and brewing.
yeah.
And we are getting involved in their brewing science program at Auburn University, which is really great. So you can find our beer. And one of the things that I like about New Realm is that we made a decision when we opened that we weren't going to try and sell our beer in any state where we didn't have a brewery
Mm,
on the ground.
yeah.
So right now you can buy our beer in the whole state of Virginia, Georgia, a little bit of Alabama, mostly around the Auburn area, maybe soon to be in Montgomery and Birmingham. I'm not sure. South Carolina in the Charleston area. We're building out a brewery in Greenville, South Carolina
Beautiful.
right now.
Yeah.
So we do sell our beer in the Greenville area. Eventually we'll probably be in the whole state of South Carolina, but we're patient with that kind of stuff and want to make sure that we can support the sales. With that brewery on the ground. All of our breweries have restaurants, so you can go in and get some really good food and a nice selection of beers. But we don't have aspirations to go national or be a large regional. We might, I think, as we move forward, we might be in Tennessee and Florida, and more in Alabama, but that's probably about the extent of it. I don't think we have aspirations to go any further than that. Yeah. And, I think we've learned a lot about the business and trying to manage a national business is really hard. Also, I don't think the industry is at a place where, breweries that are regional breweries that try to expand too far outside of their zone are doing well, right? It's a real challenge because there's so many local great options. So localness is very important for us.
Yeah.
And supporting the communities we're in, all that kind of stuff. That's what we want to do, and that's who we want to be.
I mean, and I think sometimes I think that's one of the things that can get lost is, I mean, I don't remember how long ago it was, but I was shocked. I remember it was at least a few years back. I was looking at some BA data on, importance for, the craft beer consumer, what the list of things that were important, and local was still number one. Local was beating quality, which always blows my mind. I supporting local business, and that's great. And everybody around the area, please support us. But it's one of those things where local still is a thing, and it makes sense that you want to have a footprint in that space if you're going to be selling your beer there, right? Like you have that home base, right? Because I do think people have a connection to a place of production, even if it's not where the super majority of the beer is coming from, right?
Yeah.
I think those two things definitely pair up in the eye of the consumer.
I think so too, and I certainly see it in Atlanta. There's a very strong beer community here, and they're very loyal to the people that have been brewing here for a long time. And they may switch breweries, but the beer community is loyal to the brewer, not the brewery sometimes. And and I think I think that's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing to be part of a beer community like that. And certainly I've been fortunate. I've lived in some great beer communities in my career. I've lived in Colorado and New England, near Boston and San Diego, of course, Northern California, and now Atlanta. And Atlanta's completely underrated, but it's got the same vibe that any of these other places have as far as the intense focus on the beer community and what they like. And, it's just fun to be part of that.
Definitely. Well, listen, Mitch, once again, we're gonna wrap up here. If you could hold on the line for just a second so I could chat to you offline real quickly.
All right.
Everybody, thanks so much for tuning in. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks again to our guest, Mitch Steele. Thanks a lot, Mitch.
Thank you.